All right. Well, welcome to our Lunch and Learn, everyone. My name is Jen Bernstein, and I am the Advocacy Manager at National Council of Jewish Women St. Louis. And we're so excited to have you once again for the Lunch and Learn today. Just a couple of things to tell you about before we get started. I wanted to let everyone know that next month, our Lunch and Learn will be with Emily Manley from Fox 2 News, St. Louis, who will be doing a legislative recap. The Missouri legislative session ends on May 13th, so I'm sure she will have a lot to say. The next Lunch and Learn is on May 19th at the same time, noon, and we would love to have you. It should be pretty great. And we've got lots of events coming up, so make sure to look in your 5 Ways to Advocate, which comes out on every Monday. For those of you who are not signed up already, just shoot me an email. I'll put my email in the chat and we will be happy to get you signed up for 5 Ways to Advocate. Right now, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole, who is going to introduce our speaker. Thanks again for joining us today.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Gorofsky, and I'm the chairperson of these Lunch and Learns. And I am here today to introduce Jeff Dion, who is a dear friend and also just a ridiculously talented human. So Jeff was the executive director of the National Crime Victim Bar Association for many years, and now he is the executive director at the Zero Abuse Project. The Zero Abuse Project is a project that aims to end child abuse in 3 generations, which is just a ridiculously amazing goal. And I'm going to let Jeff tell you a little bit more about himself. And all right, let's hear it, Jeff.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. I appreciate the warm welcome and the invitation to speak with all of you today. I'm Jeff Dion. I'm a lawyer by training. For the last 25 years, I've worked in victim services, and I am a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And Zero Abuse Project is dedicated to eliminating all forms of abuse, and they're often tied together. And we know that many victims are victims of what we call polyvictimization, that they're not just victims of one type of abuse. And it's important that we treat all of them. Oftentimes, and so a lot of my comments today will sometimes be focused on childhood sexual abuse, but some of the same methods that we use to combat that apply to forms of physical abuse and neglect as well. And, we're a small, intimate group. So once I start sharing my screen, you can raise your hand or put something in the chat, or even shout out if I don't actually see your little hand come up on the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and share some slides with you. So I want to talk to you all today about Zero Abuse Project's plan to end child abuse. And we'll start with some definitions. And so we define child sexual abuse as any sexual contact but with a minor committed by any person, including other juveniles. Juvenile on juvenile sexual abuse is a huge and often underreported problem, but the ramifications are just as serious. And as a matter of law, children lack the legal capacity to consent to sex. And so often survivors themselves will say, well, nobody put a gun to my head and made me do that. I wanted to do that, but they don't recognize that they really didn't have the legal capacity to consent. So even if they wanted to, it didn't count. And so what happens to them constituted abuse, and we need adults to be adults, and we need to make sure we have systems in place that protect kids from abuse, even if it sometimes means protecting kids from their own curiosity or hormonal desires. And so who are the perpetrators of abuse? Well, we know that the vast majority of abuse is perpetrated by family and household members simply because those are the people who have the greatest access to kids, parents, step-parents, older siblings, mom's boyfriend, because sexual abuse is something that doesn't often occur with witnesses. And so where can someone get a child alone? Now, if the abuse happens outside of the home, then the perpetrator is most often someone that the child trusts or who's in a position of authority, whether it's a teacher or youth leader or faith leader or anything like that. And abusers who don't have access to kids will often seek out jobs or volunteer activities that will give them access to kids. And I'll talk about that a little more. I say, if you don't have access to children, it's really hard to sexually abuse children if all you can do is sit on a park bench and give out candy, right? And so you really need help. And where they get that help is from otherwise well-meaning institutions that hire people or bring them on as volunteers whose goal is to infiltrate their organization to get access to kids. And that's why organizations and institutions can't be blind to that, and they have a responsibility to know that's happening and take appropriate measures to prevent it. And yes, some abuse is perpetrated by strangers. Statistically, it's the smallest percentage of abuse. But if you're my and Nicole's age, then that's all they were teaching us growing up, right? And that it was all about stranger danger. And they never said anything about your uncle or your grandfather or a teacher. And so you think, oh, well, no stranger did that to me. So, this doesn't count. And so those are the people who are really committing the abuse. What's the impact of abuse? Well, we know that the ramifications are serious and lifelong. Abuse survivors are more likely to abuse or be addicted to drugs, alcohol, sex, any type of substances or activities that they abuse to really self-medicate. Abuse survivors have a higher incidence of depression, suicide, post-traumatic stress. They have higher incidence of family and relationship dysfunction. And the hard thing is that oftentimes these problems aren't manifested until many years after the abuse occurs and, until they're well into adulthood. Sometimes people will always say, well, there was an impact right away because I was getting straight A's and then I was getting C's and D's. But for some people, the impact isn't apparent until they go through a whole bunch of life cycles of having problems with X, whatever it is, any of the things on this screen, and then they look back and realize that all of this has been tied to the abuse they suffered as a kid. And so our goal is to end child abuse in all its forms. And what keeps us from doing that? Well, my colleague, Victor Veith, who's a former prosecutor, who started prosecuting cases in rural Minnesota in the early 90s, has done a lot of work on this, and he identified 5 primary obstacles to ending child abuse. And the first is that, most children suspected of being abused are not reported into the system. Sometimes this is about delayed disclosure. We know people don't, it could take 20 or 30 years before a victim discloses that this happened to them. Sexual abuse doesn't always leave the same types of marks or injuries or physical evidence that physical abuse does, so it might not be caught. And even if a child does disclose, oftentimes they're not believed. One of the first victims who came forward who was abused by Jerry Sandusky at Penn State people didn't believe them. How could you say such a terrible thing about someone who's done so much for you and so much for this community? But what we know is that's part of their MO, to put themselves in positions of trust and authority, to hold themselves up as almost being above reproach, so nobody would dare believe those things. The second obstacle to ending abuse is that even if the abuse is reported, a lot of kids are just never going to have their cases assessed or investigated. When cases aren't investigated, that means that those offenders can continue to abuse with impunity. Because, hey, someone even told, nothing happened, and I can still do this. So I'm good and I can do it more. The third obstacle is that a lot of times investigators and other frontline responders are often inadequately trained and inexperienced in addressing these things. Now, Nicole started her career as a prosecutor, and in so many prosecutors' offices, where do they put the brand new green attorneys who are just learning? Sometimes it might be in traffic court or general district court, where they're going to be prosecuting misdemeanors. But then the next step up is usually juvenile and domestic relations court, where a lot of these abuse cases are heard. So you might have people who don't have a lot of experience as a lawyer, and certainly don't have a lot of experience in dealing with these types of cases. And as they work their way up that prosecutorial ladder, they get moved to other types of cases, bigger cases, right? And so they don't spend a lot of time there. And we really need people who have the expertise to deal with these cases effectively. Even judges, when someone who's appointed as a judge, the vast majority of time, I'm going to believe that they are a well-qualified attorney and who is qualified to be a judge. But even then, many of them have not had any experience whatsoever with child abuse cases, but they're the ones who are hearing these cases and making these rulings. And so we have to make sure that the people who are there that are dealing with this really are have some a foundational expertise in this subject area. The fourth one is that even when abuse is substantiated, oftentimes the child is older and it's more difficult to address the physical and emotional hardships caused by the abuse. It's sort of a yin and yang. The older the child is, the easier it is to get a conviction because the child can speak and can tell someone what happened and can offer testimony. But oftentimes by that point, the harm has been, has settled in. The younger a child is, the more resilient a child is, but very young children who might not even be able to speak yet. And some people, some abusers will target children too young to speak because they won't be able to tell what happened to them. And even if a child is able to speak, they have to be much older than that before the court is going to consider their testimony to be reliable. And the fifth problem, an obstacle, is one that's sort of timeless. Kids don't have a good lobby, right? We know the AARP has a great lobby. The NRA has a great lobby. The trial lawyers have a pretty good lobby, but kids don't really have a good lobby. Why? Because they don't really have a moneyed interest that's fighting for them, that has a unified voice to talk to policymakers about how critically important this is. And that if you want to solve the rest of society's problems, one of the things you need to do is start here. So that kids really get their fair share of our country's scarce financial resources. And so addressing these obstacles is what we're all about. So let me tell you a little bit about Zero Abuse Project. We were created in 2018, so this is just our fourth year. And even though we're a new organization, a lot of our component parts have been around for much longer, some 30 years or more, that have now come together under this one umbrella to work together collaboratively to address this problem. And back in 2005, Victor Veith published his law review article called Under the Third Generation. And it was his premise that we are still operating on today, that we can end child abuse in this country in 3 generations. And he counted each generation as a period of 40 years. And so the theory is that we could end child abuse in 120 years. And that's beyond my lifetime, but so we have to create the momentum for this to continue after we're gone. But the good news is that we're already 20 years into that first generation, and we can look back at a lot of the issues that Victor has identified and the tremendous progress that we've made in those last 20 years to helping address this issue and why we need to keep moving it forward. So Zero Abuse Project has a number of different components, and this infographic is designed to show how we can intervene at different stages in a case, but all those different parts work together. So I use the example of a young girl who was abused by a custodian at her school. And so our Jacob Wetterling Resource Center does a lot with prevention education. And they have a program called Empower Me. And it's about teaching kids to be smart, not scared, and about letting kids know they need to have a safety net of 5 trusted adults that they can tell anything to, that they need to recognize that sort of uh-oh feeling in your stomach and what do you do about it, and understanding the difference between secrets and surprises. Secrets are bad, but surprises are okay. And oftentimes, and so we will do this program in schools, churches, youth groups, all over the place. And sometimes when we do this presentation, a child will make a disclosure. And so if the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center came to do Empower Me at this little girl's school and she made a disclosure, having that discussion and saying this is okay to talk about prompted that child to make that disclosure, because as good as law enforcement and child protective services are, they can't do anything about a case they don't know about. And so the first thing is prompting that disclosure. And then someone would respond, would report this, and child protective services would get involved. Hopefully that caseworker or the social worker from Child Protective Services had been through in their undergraduate curriculum our Child Advocacy Studies program. This is a program that's usually an academic minor, and it's designed that way so it can be paired with any major. It could be paired with criminal justice or psychology or social work or early childhood education, and really explore the intersection between those 2 disciplines. And so people who are going to devote some portion of their professional career to protecting kids will go through a program like this, and it's an experiential education program. It's in 85 colleges and universities around the country. It's in 2 medical schools, 3 law schools, and 3 seminaries. And oftentimes these programs have mock houses. So students can practice going into someone else's house and what they're going to encounter. And it's all videotaped so that the class can critique them afterwards. They have mock courtrooms so they can practice offering testimony in court. And we've got 7 different peer-reviewed studies that show that CAST graduates are better prepared to go to work, that they last longer, they have less burnout, less turnover, which is better for the kids and better for the system. So hopefully the social worker who responds to that little girl's school will have been trained in CAST, in child advocacy studies, and is really prepared to do their job. And if they make a finding that the abuse happened, then they'd turn that over. That child would go to a forensic investigator at a child advocacy center and talk to someone who is specially trained to interview children. You know, prosecutors, and Nikki remembers this, having been both a state and federal prosecutor, sometimes prosecutors will look at a child abuse case and they'll say, you know, look, I've got to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt, but all I've got is the victim's word versus the defendant's word. And, you know, it's what one person said versus what the other said. And you know, how do I get that with just that? How do I win this case? We know that an effective forensic interview can yield between 20 and 40 pieces of corroborating evidence that can build up the prosecutor's chance for success. And so it's really important that as a part of the investigation and a part of the prosecution, that the child see a trained forensic interviewer who can speak to the child in age-appropriate terms, ask open-ended questions. And, you know, the most common thing is they might say something and our interviewer will say, well, tell me more about that. You know, just not you know, putting words in the child's mouth, but just trying to get more information and a better understanding. And our training curriculum called Child First has been adopted by 23 states. And so more than 60% of the country lives in a state that uses our forensic interviewing protocols. With that evidence, it would be turned over for prosecution. And we have a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice to train prosecutors and other members of the multidisciplinary team on the effective and trauma-informed prosecution of child abuse. One of the things Victor learned in the early 90s when he started prosecuting these cases was, you know, if we're going to be effective, everybody needs to be working together. We need to have Child Protective Services and law enforcement and prosecutors all sitting down at the same table talking to each other. And that's how they formed the first multidisciplinary team. So it's about training prosecutors, but also making sure everybody else who's a part of that process and a part of that team understands these concepts and is working together. And we train prosecutors how to effectively prosecute these cases and how to do it in a way that is not harmful to the child. And so hopefully this girl would go through that, and that the custodian who abused her is convicted. Now, oftentimes when something like that happens, it's going to make the news. And then all of a sudden, other people are coming forward and saying, wait a minute, you know, he did that to me too, because he's been at this school for 30 years. And nobody else had come forward because they thought, well, maybe no one's going to believe me, or they thought I'm the only one. And when they know that it happened to other people, then other folks start coming forward. But there's a limited amount of time in which you can bring a criminal prosecution. And if the statute of limitations has expired, that custodian might not be able to be criminally prosecuted. But a number of states, and a growing number of states, have created what we call civil windows, where they for a limited amount of time, suspend the civil statute of limitations for child sex abuse so that the school or the perpetrator can be sued and held accountable. Back in 2001, when California opened the first civil window, they opened a civil window and a criminal window. But the US Supreme Court said, nope, sorry, you cannot retroactively change a criminal statute of limitations. They said, but you can do civil. And so that's why civil is sort of the only option, and why you see so much information coming out from all of these cases in civil windows. Yeah, Nicole.
Hey, Jeff, I was just going to say in Missouri, it's the exact opposite. So they just extended our criminal statute of limitations so that childhood sexual abuse, as long as it's a Class A or B felony, there is no statute of limitations. But this civil, they say no retroactivity. So Like, we're never going to get a civil window in Missouri because it's against our state constitution to have retroactive statutes.
Uh,
I know.
And that right. And that's terrible, because why should the government have an unlimited amount of time to hold someone accountable, but the victim doesn't have the same amount of time? So then under this scenario, someone could be convicted beyond a reasonable doubt that they did this, and the victim would have no recourse for holding them accountable to them for the harm that they caused. So a number of states have done this, and where states have opened civil windows, we work to increase awareness among victims about what that means. California has a civil window that is open right now, and there's a couple-minute video that we've done to help people understand what this means and how it works, and I'll share that with you now.
For the past 16 years, in the state of California, it has been impossible to hold child sex predators and the institutions that cover up their abuse accountable for their crimes after just a short amount of time had gone by. This made it increasingly difficult to protect our kids from child sex abuse. Thankfully, the state of California passed a critical new law, Assembly Bill 218, or AB 218, that changes that. How, you ask? By lifting the statute of limitations. A statute of limitations is a legal stopwatch that counts down the time to file a civil lawsuit. It is important for survivors of child sexual abuse, friends and family of survivors, or organizations interacting with survivors to know when the clock starts ticking, when the clock stops ticking, and whether anything restarts the clock. California's restrictive statute of limitations blocked many survivors from coming forward. Now, AB 218 expands the statute of limitations. Previously, survivors had to file a civil lawsuit against their abuser and the institutions that covered for them before they turned just 26 years old. Now, survivors have until age 40 to file a civil lawsuit. In most cases, childhood sexual abuse goes unreported or is reported many years after the abuse occurs. In fact, the average age of disclosure for adult survivors is 48. This makes expanding the statute of limitations critically important, as it gives survivors the time they need to become comfortable coming forward. When survivors have time, they can file a civil lawsuit, putting them on a journey towards justice and protecting kids from future abuse. Finally, and most urgently, from January 1st, 2020 until December 31st, 2022, survivors of any age whose statute of limitations expired prior to January 1st, 2020 can file a civil suit against their abuser no matter how long ago the abuse occurred. This window, open for 3 years, will allow survivors of child sexual abuse, no matter their current age and no matter when the abuse took place, to take action and hold their abuser and the institutions who covered for these predators accountable through a civil lawsuit. Child sex abuse survivors in California can hold predators and the institutions who covered for them accountable, and California will be able to protect all our kids. If you were sexually abused as a child, AB 218 will allow you to take action and find justice. Doing so only requires a few quick, easy steps to connect with an organization that can help. To learn more about how you may be able to find justice, you can call the National Crime Victim Bar Association, a certified nonprofit attorney referral service for a commitment-free, confidential conversation on the next steps you may be able to take to file a civil suit. Or you can visit victimbar.org/referrals to learn more about AB 218, who you can speak with, what your options are, and what you may need to file a suit.
So it's not just in California. You know, we've had civil windows open in Minnesota and New York and New Jersey and North Carolina and Vermont and Arkansas and California and Hawaii. And so it's something that's taking place in a lot of places around the country. And it's really important because I always tell people, because when we see how long it takes for survivors to come forward, oftentimes because it takes them that long to recognize that what happened to them constitutes abuse. And how can you expect someone to file a lawsuit before they even know they've been harmed? And so that's why these are so important. And so the Zero Abuse Project just last October was issued a grant by the Office for Victims of Crime to help increase awareness and provide resources to adult survivors. We're going to be creating a website and app called Survivor Space that provides these types of resources to survivors. And we're going to be working with 1 in 6, which is a group that provides support for male victims of sexual abuse, which is a largely underserved population, to increase their online facilitated support groups that they offer. Now, back when Victor did this law review article and identified these obstacles to abuse, he also came up with some recommendations. And I want to let you know what those were and sort of where we're at with them today. And the first was that colleges and universities really need to provide more specific information and experiential education for people who are going to work in the child advocacy field. And that's what CAST grew out of. And now we're at more than 85 universities in 28 states. So in the last 20 years, we've gone from 0 to 85 and growing. Victor made a recommendation that every state should have a high quality forensic interviewing training program by 2040. Currently, at least 35 states have a program. 23 of them use our program. And so we're making great progress and making sure that there's a good forensic interviewing program, and so that prosecutors and law enforcement can get the best available evidence to help support their case. There was a recommendation that prosecutors have to be adequately trained. In one of Victor's early cases, it was a termination of parental rights case. And he says that, nobody in that courtroom knew what they were doing. I didn't, the judge didn't, the defense attorney didn't. And he had a social worker who was on the stand, and the defense attorney cross-examined him and said, "Isn't it true that you removed that child from the home with no authority and that you were not allowed to do that?" And the social worker said, "Yes, that's true, but I went into the home and the child was on the ground and covered in maggots, and I didn't know what to do, so I scooped him up and took him to the emergency room." From then he knew everybody needs to understand the dynamics of abuse and needs better training so that kids can be well served. Sadly, one of the things that always makes headlines is when a child is killed. And oftentimes there is information that the child was involved in child protective services. There had been previous reports. But one thing I know for certain is that nobody who worked in child protective services wanted that child to die. And so what do we do to make sure that they have the resources and training to give that child the best shot at a safe future? Victor also recommended that in their role as community leaders, child protection professionals have to enlist the support of the faith-based community. And so we work with faith leaders across the spectrum to identify what they can do to prevent abuse within their faith communities, and also what they can do to appropriately respond when people come to them with abuse that's happened at home or happened outside of their community. And how someone responds, the first time person that someone discloses abuse to, how that person responds will oftentimes dictate whether or not that person will ever tell anybody else. And one of the things that we know is that people in faith communities, regardless of what denomination, are at increased risk of exploitation. Why? Because it's someplace people go where they want to feel that they can trust those people. These are good people. These are my people. These are God's people, right? But people who want to exploit them will often put themselves in those positions there so they can make themselves above reproach, whether they're trying to financially exploit people or whether they're trying to abuse kids. With child sexual abuse, we know that it happens everywhere, but it is a more difficult problem and is exacerbated in communities that are hierarchical and that are closed communities. Okay. And so that's why we see more abuse in Orthodox Jewish communities than we see in Reform or conservative congregations, because it's a type of control. You can't talk to anybody else. You've got to listen to our news. And, you know, if you have a problem, you don't go to the police, you go to the rabbi. And that's how they control all this. And it's the same thing in you know, in Muslim mosques, in the Catholic Church. Nobody is immune from it, but where it's closed and hierarchical, it often seems that it is allowed to fester because, just like many institutions, they're much more interested in protecting the institution than protecting children. But I know from my experience in working with victims and, you know, 40 plus years of dealing with victimization, that someone's personal faith can be a tremendous tool for healing. But when the abuse or exploitation comes from their faith community, not only is someone harmed, but it also takes away one of their tools for coping. So it's like breaking someone's leg and stealing their crutch. You know, as Victor prosecuted cases, he always tells the story of a 6-year-old girl who was sexually abused. And one of the questions that she had was, am I still a virgin in God's eyes? And so how, you know, people's faith is important to them, and how they look at that and use that is important. And so that's why we need to talk to faith leaders. And so we have a program called Keeping Faith, which is a 2-day program for people to understand how to respond to accusations of abuse and how to make sure that they have the youth protection policies in place within their congregations that are going to help keep kids safe. And so, you know, where do we go? We've got a couple different goals that I'll just touch on real quickly, and then really just want to be able to open it up for a discussion and questions. Our first goal is we want to increase disclosure and reporting. We want to make it easier for people to come forward. And we want to make sure when someone reports abuse, you hear all this talk about mandated reporters. We want to make sure people who are mandated reporters know what that means and know what to do. That the person who actually got the information from the child is the person who makes the report. Because the more layers it goes through, it's like the old game of telephone. Things get added, things get left out. And so for the best available information, there should be the shortest transfer of information possible from the child to the person who's making the official report. And making sure that they know the questions to ask so that that report has all of the information so that authorities can take action on it. The second is making sure that there is an effective investigation, that we have to provide child maltreatment education and skills development. And we do that. We train over 40,000 child protection professionals with more than 400 different training topics. We need to build a more capable child protection workforce, whether those folks are in law enforcement, are in child protective services, or prosecutors. We need to make sure that all of them have the tools that they need to be good protectors of children. One of the research studies shows that first-year medical residents missed 80% of signs of complex physical child abuse. They missed 80% of them. Yet, after just a 1-credit seminar, those residents caught like 72% of those signs. And so just a little bit of information is going to go a long way to protecting kids and helping identify those issues so that there can be an intervention. We've got to do a better job of prevention. We can prevent child sex abuse through the use of empowering, positive, engaging communication methods. Because if you say to people, and this is where, we always say that we focus on education and training. And I think education and training are two separate things, so they're very closely related. Because if you don't know anything about a topic, and this is new to you, you need some education, right? And if people are gonna listen to us, their ears have to be open. And if you say to someone, hey, how'd you like to talk about child sex abuse? Most people would be like, I'd rather have a root canal, right? And so how do we talk about this issue without and deal with that ick factor and without turning people off and saying, oh, I don't even want to think about that, because we need everybody to think about it, because everybody's got a role to play in keeping kids safe. And so if we can talk about it in a way that doesn't make them uncomfortable, that isn't scary, then we can make a difference with how people react. Now, the training part, I see more as professional development. When we train prosecutors, law enforcement, social workers, they're already dealing, we don't have to tiptoe around the word child sex abuse. They deal with it every day. And we can say, look, this is what you need to know. These are the skills you need to develop and how we can help you. And so that's how education and training go hand in hand. We need to make sure that everybody who responds in a trauma-informed way, and that they don't do more harm than good. And also, we have to foster a national commitment to recognizing child sex abuse as a public health crisis. I have talked about this so I was talking about this pre-pandemic, okay? And this is a public health crisis because there's a really famous study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And if you don't know about it, look into it, just Google it. Back in the 80s, doctors and with Kaiser Permanente, they had a support group for people who were trying to lose weight. And some people were successful and some people weren't. They were trying to figure out why these other people weren't successful. What do they all have in common? Well, they all learned that they had bad experiences in childhood. And so they did this massive study. And what they found was the more adverse experiences a child has in childhood, and those are things like the death of a parent, the incarceration of a parent, witnessing domestic violence, being physically or sexually abused, things like that, that it didn't matter how much it happened or how frequently it happened or how bad it was, but the more boxes that got checked, the greater the chances were that this person was going to have poor health outcomes later in life. And if so many of the things that we're fighting against as a society with mental health issues and drug addiction and alcoholism, if all of that is all rooted in childhood trauma, then no wonder, and that 25% of the population was sexually abused as kids, 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys, if there's that many people that were sexually abused, no wonder all of these things are a huge problem. And that's why we've got to get a handle on it. And then just about 2 weeks ago, Duke University came out with a research study, and they found a correlation between childhood abuse and vaccine resistance. And what they theorized was because it has to do with a violation of trust. Because the abuse that these people suffered as kids was a violation of trust, they are much less likely to trust people in positions of authority or institutions about anything. And when you think about it, it makes sense. So if we want to talk about, there's a direct line between addressing childhood abuse and a public health crisis like the COVID pandemic. So helping people connect the dots and realizing that everyone's got a role to play is what we're going to do. And even if we are, we won't solve this problem in my lifetime. I think Martin Luther King said, just because we can't see the top of the staircase doesn't mean we don't climb those first few steps. And that's the direction that we need to move in. And we need to make sure that others who will continue this work after we are gone stay on that focus, so that in the not too distant future, child abuse will be a thing in the past. And with that, I'd love to just open it up to folks for questions or comments or anything else they'd like to discuss.
Well, I don't know if everyone here knows, but NCJW was one of the co-founders of the Child Abuse Prevention Program, which now is housed at Jewish Family and Children's Jewish Family Services. And it's been around since 1992. And as far as I know, they still go out and they talk to kids about how to protect themselves against sexual abuse, to say no, run and tell a trusted adult, to always trust their instincts, to keep telling until someone believes them, that kind of thing. And they've seen over hundreds of thousands of people. So we do have a wonderful program here that NCJW was instrumental in helping to start. And I know they do training for teachers and parents as well.
And, Jen had asked a question in the chat that I want to say, yes, there is a correlation between sexual abuse and eating disorders. But it's not intuitive, okay? Now, I've known this for 15 or 20 years. So, but if you haven't thought about it, a lot of people don't make that connection. And that's why, and because there's oftentimes a latency to those problems that don't manifest until later in life, it's hard for people to make that connection. It's sort of like being exposed to asbestos now and getting lung cancer, or getting, mesothelioma 30 years from now, or being in a car accident today, but your leg breaks 2 years from now. And it's like, wait, that was connected to that back then. And so, yes, there absolutely is that connection between sexual abuse and eating disorders as well. And that's why, people who treat eating disorders know that they've got to ask these questions and try and identify the root causes so that they can help folks.
I just want to say thank you, because this was so interesting and so well organized. I think I had like 10 questions as you were talking. But I guess one that stuck with me is in terms of the states that you have the better training and that you have worked with. Have you found, results wise, more disclosures and reporting? Like, are there numbers to back that, to back up your premise?
Yeah, absolutely. And we across the board see the age of disclosure coming down because we are removing the stigma. And one of the things that we talk about is fostering a culture of disclosure. There are, so often people will say, well, I had suspicions, I thought something was weird, but I didn't know, so I felt I couldn't say anything. Right? Yes, I thought it was weird that teacher papered over all the windows in his room so nobody could see into it. I thought it was weird that, he would have kids alone in there and isolate them from other kids. But I didn't know anything, so I didn't say. And so what we want to do is make sure that the policies that, and when we say we talk about fostering policies, not just public policies in the form of a statute, but also organizational policies and organizational cultures, better to ask the questions than let something go on, or better to make sure that we have, if you have good systems in place that say that adults and children shouldn't be, interacting on social media outside of the organization in a way, unless it's in a way that, parents are a part of that, if we can frustrate abusers' tools in how they like to isolate kids and groom kids, then we can keep that from happening. And we need to make sure we have a culture that supports that within organizations and outside of organizations. I've always said that if Penn State would have fired Jerry Sandusky as soon as it found out about the sexual abuse allegations, yes, it would have been a bad media story for a couple of days, right? But because they didn't do anything, it turned into a nightmare that resulted in the criminal conviction of their president and their athletic director that went on for years. And so I think reasonable people understand that sexual abuse can happen anywhere. And I don't think they're necessarily going to fault an organization because abuse happened there, but how that organization responds to that abuse and what actions they take to make sure that it doesn't happen again is really what people are going to be looking for to judge. And if they haven't dealt with it yet, they're going to, and we want to be here to help those organizations say, this is what you can do to keep kids safe. And this is how you need to respond. Yeah, Diana.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks so much for this really, really excellent presentation. I've had a counseling practice for many years, and a long time ago, I had a situation where a mom had brought her young daughter to see me, and she had 2 children, and the older one had been sexually abused by grandpa. Mm-hmm. And apparently grandpa was well known in the community, and everything got hushed up, and mom's attorney told her that it was not necessary to hotline it because of the ramifications that might take place, and that it wasn't required that it be hotlined as long as she kept her children away from grandpa. Well, when I heard that story, I knew that wasn't right, and I was obligated as a mandated reporter, and I did hotline it. Mom had told me that her attorney told her,
right,
that as long as her girls were safe, that it didn't have to be hotline. So here was someone from the community. Mm-hmm. I was somewhat inexperienced with this at the time. I did go ahead and hotline it. Nothing ever came of it. And I'm curious now in retrospect, if I'd have known you or Nikki, I would have picked up the phone and said, what do I do now? What would have been the appropriate thing to do to pursue that? Because just because these girls were safe from him didn't mean other children were safe from him.
Right. Well, it means that whoever's taking that call, you did the right thing, but the people on the other end of the phone need to be trained and ready to deal with it no matter who it is. And follow the appropriate procedures, that the kids should have been brought in for a forensic interview. And if they, they were able to make a finding to investigate more, and then it should have gone forward, because, The problem is when people think that they're above the law, and when it's not evenly enforced, people do get away with it. And I think it's what we need to do to break the cycle. You know, one time I was out in I guess, I think it's this week is National Crime Victims' Rights Week, or next week. And 1 year for National Crime Victims' Rights Week, I was out speaking at a dinner in Arizona, and there was a survivor who spoke, and he had been sexually abused by his dad. And he grew up and he left the house, but that trauma was all unresolved. And as a result of the abuse, he started drinking and doing drugs. And because of that, you know, he got divorced, and he had 2 little kids, and he lost his job, and he had no place else to go. And what did he do? Him and his kids moved in with his dad. And what does his dad do? His dad sexually abused the grandkids. And so here's the father who's a victim, but just feels like, you know, I couldn't protect my kids, but things are better because those girls said something. And the grandfather was arrested and prosecuted. And that's how we break that cycle, because the help was there for the girls that wasn't there for their dad when he needed it when he was a kid. And that's so as heartbreaking as these things are, that's where I see the promise that yes, we are making a difference and things are getting better, but we can't rest until we completely solve this problem.
Thank you.
Well, if there are no more questions, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. Jeff or Nicole, do you have anything else to add before we wrap up?
I just want to thank you for your time and attention today. And if you have other questions or want to reach out, you know, find us at our website is zeroabuseproject.org, and we're happy to help.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say thank you to Jeff for doing this. It was a great presentation, and I'm sure everybody feels the same way. So thank you, Jeff.
All right.
Thank
Thanks.
you
Take
so
care,
much.
everybody. All right. Bye now.
And I'm going to be sending out a link to the evaluation. If you all would be so kind to fill that out, that would be wonderful. And we will see you next month at the next Lunch and Learn. Thank you so much. Thanks again, Jeff.
Bye
It was
now.
wonderful.
Very good.
Thanks
Yeah.
so much, Jeff.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thanks. It was
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, it was.